Can you increase the speed of your repetitions in order to build more muscle? That's what we're going to be talking about on today's episode of the show. Now, when it comes to hypertrophy and building muscle, tempo is quite an important component of the whole process. Now, you can build muscle regardless of what tempo you use, but sometimes depending on your skill and your experience level, you might find it more difficult to do so with faster repetitions. And we will come into the whys and wherefores of why that might be over the course of the episode of this show. The one thing that I really wanted to dig into though is some of the research around tempo usage, especially on that concentric part of the lift. So when you are actually pressing that bar on a bench press, or you're squatting out of the hole when you're doing your barbell back squats, whatever the exercise may be, there is some research that delves into that side of tempo and gives us some insight into how you should really strive to perform an exercise in order to get the most out of it. So if you're watching this video on YouTube, liking the video, subscribing to the channel would be awesome. And if you're listening to this podcast on any sort of podcasting platform, leaving a review and a rating would also be pretty epic if you enjoy this video. But for now, let's get started and delve into the topic of tempo and hypertrophy. Typically, when you see people using faster repetitions in the gym, it comes combined with poor form, poor technique, which impacts hypertrophy in a negative way. So for example, if people let the weight crash down towards their chest in a bench press, or they bounce out of a squat, then they're really using the pace of that repetition, that dropping of the bar, the gravity is taking all of the work out of the muscle, and you're just basically letting momentum and inertia really benefit you, but not actually benefit the process of building muscle, because arguably you're losing tension on the muscle. You are not in control of that repetition every inch of the way. So you need to get away from the tendency, if you have it, in order to use a fast repetition as that process of bouncing things off your chest, bouncing out of squats, bouncing weights around, whether they're dumbbells, barbells, machines, anything like that. When it comes to a tempo, regardless of whether you're going slow or you're trying to go a little bit quicker, you need to make sure that you adhere to the fundamental principle that you are in control of every inch of that repetition. Because if you are not, then arguably you are not using your muscle to lift and move that load, which, let's face it, that's what you're trying to do when it comes to build muscle. You are trying to create that tension on that muscle so that that muscle or muscles that you're trying to build and grow are the ones that are doing the work. If you're allowing gravity, inertia, momentum to do the work for you, you're leaving gains on the bench or the gym floor, or whatever analogy you want to use. So with that said, is there an ideal tempo for hypertrophy? Now, to answer this question, we are going to dig into a little bit of research. Now, there's a study done in 2014 that looked at a volume equated bench press program. And we're going to have a look at what the difference was between using a faster repetition and also a slower repetition. In the study, one group used maximum velocity to push the weight, so as fast as they possibly could to push that weight out, whereas the other group consciously tried to do it at half the pace. So you've got one group going relatively quickly, one with a more considered and slower tempo. And the results, well, they were quite interesting, because it was actually the slower repetition group that saw less improvements in strength. Now, why might that be the case? Well, it might be the case because there's less force production, because when you're trying to lift something quickly, you're maybe recruiting more muscle fibers and you're using bigger loads, so therefore you're recruiting those muscle fibers and creating more force. Could be one potential explanation. The other explanation could be if you are using a slower repetition, then you are potentially using a lighter weight. Maybe you're doing more repetitions, maybe you're fatiguing quite quickly, you're actually tiring out, maybe some of the other supporting muscles are tiring before the muscle you're actually trying to work. These could be all reasons and scenarios why the results might be the case. It's also important to remember that strength is potentially one of the markers for hypertrophy. It may be one of the things that you are going to assess to see whether you are building muscle, but you can build strength without necessarily building a huge amount of muscle. So it's worth bearing that in mind, that strength improvements alone aren't necessarily the be all and end all when it comes to hypertrophy. Although over the course of the longer term, yes, you would expect to be getting stronger over the course of a training program, over the course of months and years, and so on and so forth. So the results of this study might lead you to believe, well, hey Simon, if faster repetitions had more strength and more strength might lead to more muscle, then I'm just going to go throw weights around as fast as I possibly can. If that's in your mind right now, I want you to stop right there, because there are still fundamental principles that you need to bear in mind, because you need to have good form. So this bouncing off the chest shit really isn't going to work for you. Bouncing out of the squat really isn't going to work for you. You still need to control every inch of the repetition. You're going to hear me say that a few more times over the course of this episode of the show. Control every inch of the rep, whether you're using a faster repetition tempo or using slower. Make sure you're doing everything with control. Make sure you're also using intent. So are you using and really thinking about the muscle that you're trying to work as you go through those repetitions? Now, this is one of the key principles that I teach my clients on my Lean Life Method coaching program. So we have a little acronym that's LIFT. So basically there's 4 key principles for hypertrophy that I want people to think about when it comes to lifting weight. Now, the first one is I call lock it down. Now, that's to do with the setup. That doesn't necessarily mean that you are fixed and locked in a position and nothing can move. Obviously, muscles, joints need to move throughout the course of an exercise. But where you need to keep things locked in place, or where you need to think about the setup of an exercise and keep it there, then that's one of the things that's going to provide that solid base for you to move. You're not rocking and rolling. You're not using joints that you don't want to use or you don't need to use. What needs to move moves. What doesn't need to move stays still. You're locking that setup in place. The next thing we think about is intent. So if we are doing a bench press, for example, when you are going throughout that movement, you want to make sure that you are lifting that weight primarily and biasing the pec muscle, because that's what you want to use. So when you've got the weight in the bottom position, it's closest to your chest, before you then lift that weight, you want to think about intent. Am I activating, creating tension in that target muscle and then lifting that weight? It removes all of that bouncing off the chest because it forces you. It forces you to stop, pause, think, almost take a little mental inventory of what it is that you are doing within that exercise. It could be the same for a bicep curl. When you are in the extended position, you're then thinking, before you curl that weight, can I create tension in my bicep? Am I thinking about contracting that bicep as hard as possible throughout that repetition? These are the things that you want to think about, and that applies for any exercise. If you're doing hip thrusts, you want to make sure that you are creating intent in your glutes so that you're not overusing other muscles. You're not biasing other muscles. Obviously, it's not just the glute that's moving that weight, but what you want to try and do is create intent so that you are biasing the muscle that you are trying to target. That's the key thing to think about. The third element is force. So within the framework of having that setup in place and within the framework of creating intent, now's the time to use effort. Generate some force, move some fucking weight, because you are actually going to have to work hard. You are going to have to generate as much force as possible. Now, you still have to remember that you're going to do that within the context of your setup, your form being solid, and creating intent. So you're not letting things slip to push as much weight as possible just because you've seen it done on Instagram or something like that. You're doing it with purpose. And the last thing is T, which stands for tension and tempo. So again, within the construct of those first 3 things, we want to make sure that we are creating and maintaining tension on that target muscle throughout the entirety of the rep. That principle alone stops you using gravity, inertia, momentum. It forces you to not let that weight crash to your chest or let your arm extend really quickly if you're doing a bicep curl or something like that. You're making sure that you are in control of that repetition, saying that phrase again, every inch of the rep. And then when you're using tempo can be used at that point to really try to hone in those skills. So typically if you're a beginner, trying to do a slightly slower eccentric movement, maybe you're doing a 3 to 4 eccentric movement, so you're actually really controlling that weight. Maybe a 1 to 2 concentric movement, so again, you're creating force and you're generating power from that movement, but you're not rushing things unnecessarily. As you get more experience, you can then start to play around with those tempos. You can start to increase tempos, but you're doing so from a very, very solid base that you know what you're doing. You know how to move that weight. You know how to be in control of that weight at every inch of the repetition. Again, I've said it again because I want to drill it into your brain. So when you're thinking about those various different things, that lift principle, L-I-F-T, lock it in place, that's your setup. Intent, force production, tension and tempo. These things should be working in harmony. Yes, this study from 2014 showed that a slightly quicker tempo built more strength, but it still has to be done in the construct of those core principles for hypertrophy. That's what's going to make the difference to your training. That's what's going to make difference to your longevity of your training as well. And it's what's going to help you continue to make progress over the course of time. Because if you are someone who is not in control of each inch of your repetition, you are going to hit plateaus and brick walls very, very quickly, because there's only so far that bad form will get you. Good form, worked on consistently over time, again using those principles that I've mentioned, really is going to pay dividends in the future. So I hope this episode of the show really kind of highlighted for you what some of the research says, but also how you can practically interpret that information and apply it into your training, but still have the basis and the foundation or principles of hypertrophy in place. Now, if you want to learn more about my way of doing things within Iron Paradise Fitness, then I've put a link in the show notes to my online coaching program, the Lean Life Method. So within the Lean Life Method, we look at training, we look at nutrition, we look at mindset, and we also look at education. Now, in the education part of the Lean Life Method, we have something called the Lean Life Uni. Now, that's an education platform where you get evidence-based guidance on all of the top questions that you have around training and nutrition. So we dig more into some of the aspects around those lift principles. We dig more into aspects of nutrition so that you can come away from a coaching process knowing and being confident about how to manage your own nutrition for the long term. This is not a program that's about trying to get you results in the shortest possible time frame at any cost. It's about building foundations for the long term and making sure that you have a sustainable approach, not just to losing weight, but losing weight and maintaining it, or to build muscle and keep on building muscle over the course of time in a safe way and also in the most effective way possible. So if you want to find out more information about that, and if you want to find out more information about how I can personally help you achieve the body you've been striving for, click the link in that show notes and you can have a look through all the information. And if it's something that is of interest to you, then you can schedule a free consultation call to come and talk to me all about the Lean Life Method and about online coaching itself. But for now, all I'm going to say is thanks so much for listening. Thanks so much for watching. Keep living the lean life, and I'll see you for the next episode of the show.